the main problem we have is that the way we measure progress in society is very outdated, because we only look at quantitative production growth, as if any type of production would be positive. Some is positive, some is very negative. When we were a small population on a big planet, almost anything was possible. But now, in a world with soon to be 8 billion people, we don't have the luxury to use resources the way we do, and to generate as much pollution and degrade the environment as we do. So I think we should start focusing on other measurements or indicators, because what we measure is very, very important. And I would like to move from production growth in the terms of GDP to well-being for people. The second one is, of course, to realize that we have built an economy that is extremely short-term in nature. Financial sector that I commented upon a couple of minutes ago is extremely short-term. Whatever happens after 5 to 10 years is of limited interest. And that means that all these sustainability goals that we are pursuing have a tough time in an economy which tries to maximize profit in the short term all the time. So the tension between the short term and the long term, and this discounting of the future, is, I think, very, very problematic. And finally, I think that when it comes to the exponential technologies, we really need to try to understand how they are being, how they emerge, and how we can put a framework so that they help us moving in the right direction.
I think it is interesting to talk about some of the theory that sits behind how you talk about the economy and markets and how they're embedded within each other. And go back to this question of where the public realm sits within that, where the public sector, but also where citizens sit within that. And what we do in the Institute is to try and rethink and research the role of the state in innovation in particular. And so much innovation is being needed right now, both in kind of traditional science research, what we'd see as technological innovation, these really interesting things that are coming out from the work that Ria does, but also in organizational and community-based innovation that happens much more widely than the kind of traditional places you might think. And how can the state triangulate with innovators in all these different spaces to get to outcomes that make our lives better and solve these grand societal challenges and point the economy in that direction in order to do so. And the crisis has really been the first time in years that actually everyone's first response has been to ask, what is the government going to do about this? And this happened in 2008, of course, in the financial sphere, but before that, for a long time in the financial and non-financial sphere, the actions of the state have not really been the first port of call when you come to thinking about innovation. And in many countries, not least in the UK, where Theo and I live, but also in the US, the crisis has shown up some of these shortcomings in the innovative capability of the state to respond. And I would argue that more than that, it's actually shown up how the way that we as economists think about the role of the state itself over the last half century has been very kind of inappropriate and not kind of useful. Since the 1980s, governments have really been told to take a back seat on areas like innovation, to let business steer and create wealth, and to intervene only for the purpose, and this is where it gets very market-based, of fixing market problems when they solve. So when they arise, so the idea of fixing market failures, the government is there to provide basic services, it provides education, healthcare, it sorts out potholes, depending on what country you live in, and then it gets out of the way to let the private sector assume this role of key innovation engine. And then the government comes back into play when things go wrong. So you have market failures that lead to negative externalities, or positive ones, but negative ones like pollution, which then needs to be priced out of the market with taxes, with subsidies being put in this way that Anders has talked through. But the fact that pollution still occurs, despite this ex post solving for market failures, indicates something wrong with this whole approach in terms of the outcomes that actually happen for the public good. And some countries are doing some really interesting good stuff on this. So in Wales, they have a specific post in government, which is the Commissioner for Future Generations. And that person reviews all law as it comes in and develops against the needs and vision for future generations. And so far they've stopped the expansion of a motorway. And it's really like some really concrete stuff can be drawn out when you start developing innovation within government to deal with long-term crises or with long-term societal challenges. Places like Bhutan as well have moved away from GDP to gross national happiness, and this was done, quite a while ago. Whereas New Zealand has only more recently created a budget that's based on well-being rather than GDP. So to kind of come back to your question, I think the limited and the narrow role that I've outlined that we've seen for governments for a long time means that governments are not always prepared when it comes to deal with crises like COVID or like climate, or myriad of other upcoming challenges like digital revolution, or even things like healthy aging and demographic shift.
And let me first begin by explaining very simply, preparedness in one word is readiness, and it ideally builds up to a state of future resilience of both people and planet simultaneously. And that's, I think, the ultimate goal of a green growth trajectory, and also as we seek to build back better from the COVID-19 crisis. So let me zoom into the current scenario, and we have a health crisis ongoing, which is also a type of a disaster. This is a novel zoonotic disease, which is classed as a biohazard. And preparedness is actually something that we are living with, and it's very actively ongoing, but it might be less obvious. So preparedness efforts range from individual level activities, such as, for instance, first aid provisions, to household actions like stockpiling supplies, organizational readiness, such as BCPs, business continuity planning, as well as government initiatives like contingency plans, as well as public advisory dissemination. So what I'm trying to explain by giving this sort of a sweeping snapshot is that preparedness is the prerogative of all, and not only the public or the multilateral actors. Technology in this bigger scape is an imperative piece for both preparedness and response actions. And this is where I tackle your question specifically. How so? I think the testimony is that we are connected digitally right now through communications backbones and networks, enabling work, study, business, operations, commerce, recreation, and even socializing at a safe distance. So the direct applications and the benefits that we're reaping of this, as Anders called it, exponential growth in emergent technologies is in diagnostics, where smart artificial intelligence is helping to diagnose in a more effective manner COVID-related anomalies with greater accuracy, treatment. AI is also rapidly using indexed drug libraries to undertake scores of permutation and combination to come up with a novel cure. And this is ongoing as we speak. Tracking and tracing, which is a little bit controversial, and this also speaks to the concerns that Anders mentioned about our digitally interconnected world and some of those privacy and surveillance related issues. But on the other hand, the tracking and tracing has also been successful for certain countries to curb the rapid contagion of COVID. And let me close off by saying that whilst I am an eternal optimist in the use of technology, because I've seen the benefits that it could bring when used with optimal regulation, I believe the strong connection between people, process, and technology needs to be underlined and also preserved for an effective response to this crisis, as well as any other crisis that might be induced by another event, including natural hazard. And finally, I think dropping a technology on the problem isn't the sole solution. Technology designed for a purpose is most effective. And resilient technologies, therefore, should be the goal of public, private, as well as community level actors as we seek to build back better, because those resilient systems and technologies will actually outlast any type of crisis, be it health, be it environment, be it technological, and so on. I can now put my risk analyst hat on, and I think that as long as we are human beings, we live in a complex, interconnected world. Economies, societies, and communities are very intricately linked together, and this gives rise to a multi-risk context. And we can visualize this multiple coexisting risks as like a multi-layered sort of a cake. And because of the interconnection across the borders, the threats of multiple cascading transboundary risks are a stark reality. And this sort of complexity in the riskscape, if I can call it that, has existed for time immemorial. We can just look to history, for instance, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, the 2008 global financial crisis that originated in advanced economies, but the shocks impacted emerging markets, as well as the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, which touched countries across Asia and the Pacific. So this means that this domino effect is actually something that we have dealt with in the past, but at this time, one of the biggest understandings and, let's say, sea change in policy and planning is abandoning a unidimensional way to view risk and using a systemic risk lens to analyze multiple coexisting complex risks. And that then leads me to think of recovery and reconstruction post-COVID, which should prepare countries and peoples for multiple simultaneously occurring risks, in which case agile, adaptable preparedness and response plans are quite critical. And in this respect, multilateral entities and myself working with the United Nations can say that this has been a gap in a considerable sense. And now doubly hard efforts are being dedicated to provide guidance, advisory, and support to national governments to adopt this more systemic approach to analyze and respond to risks. This is quite a long-term project, but this is why the short-sighted approach of only treating the health crisis in isolation of the ongoing climate crisis will do little good. COVID has been a testing ground for systems readiness in case of global crises taking place all at once. And as we can see, a lot more is wanting. I do want to end on a positive, forward-looking note. And I follow a lot the works of Nassim Taleb, who's a very famous economist. And he talks of black swan events, which are basically events which turn the tide in the way that things work. And I want to consider that this COVID crisis is a green swan event, which will help us to revisit the old ways of dispensing business and come up with more greener and sustainable solutions. Thank you.
This question of the public realm, a lot of the work that we do at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, where I work at UCL in London, is about how do you rethink the role of the public sector. And I'm going to kick this topic off on public response with two different but connected points that I think are very important. The first is about health, and the second one is about economics, about markets, and speaks to some of Anda's work. And then later on in this conversation, I think it will be really important to open this out into talking more about equity and about fairness of the two kind of joint crises we're currently facing. And the first point I want to make, and it's a really important one, is that the climate emergency, just like COVID-19, is a public health crisis, and it really needs to be seen in this wider context. As global heating increases, the Earth gets hotter, environments become degraded, we will see increases in respiratory diseases caused by air pollution. We'll see these new diseases developing in hot places or in close animal-human proximity. We'll see drinking water becoming more difficult to source, and just studies over the last month have been pretty depressing, coming out charting that by 2070, we'll have 3.5 billion people living in unbearable heat. And the human body is ultimately not designed to live with that much heat. This is it's really important to remember what we're seeing in the sense of people's lifestyles and people's health and well-being, and all the pressures that puts on our current system. So when you're questioning yourself or others as to how will governments, how will people deal with climate change when it comes down the line, well, we're already seeing the response to one present-day public health emergency. And the climate health elements might be slower to develop. Climate change is more cumulative, whereas COVID-19 is more contagion in terms of a taxonomy of how you look at crises, but they'll ultimately create, from the climate crisis, a web of multiple public health issues. And the threat to slow down the economy in this is very similar to what we're experiencing right now.
I'm working now with the Climate-KIC, which is an innovation program. And we have taken on a new strategy which is much more systemic in nature, realizing that single point solutions rarely bring about the impact we need when it comes to transforming society in the wake of climate change. So you need to look at many aspects in a city or a region. You don't just look at one technology or one particular vertical solution. You have to look at governance, you have to look at policy, you have to look at people, you have to look at social issues, you have to look at technology, of course, and it's all it's all coming together if you do it the right way. So the role of the public sector here in creating an environment where you ask the research and the innovation community to come up with solutions to a specific question, I think is very, very important. Now, going back to your question about the circular economy, you know, it's been interesting. I've been dealing with climate change for quite a number of years. And until very recently, we were only focusing on energy and energy systems. Quite understandable, because our energy system is still 80% based on fossil fuels. So of course we have to change that system, but we have tended to overlook the role of materials. I'm one of the members of something called the International Resource Panel, and we've done a number of studies into materials over the long term. We have come to the conclusion that the extraction and production of all kinds of materials contribute to more than 50% of carbon emissions and 80% of biodiversity loss. So that really shows that it's not only energy, it's also materials. Steel, cement, plastics, aluminium, of course fossil fuels, biomass, etc. All the way how we manage or how these materials flow through society. And today, basically linear production flows. You know, we take materials, we turn them into products, and then we throw them away after maybe a month or a few years. There's very little thought given at the beginning how to design something so that it can be reused, refurbished, so that it can have a long product life, etc. So the discussion about the circular economy is a very broad one, and there is no crystal clear definition of what the circular economy is. It's more like a metaphor of using materials more wisely. And by doing that, we save money, because we threw away a lot of money now. Secondly, we avoid becoming scarce in terms of vital materials in the future. There is a lot of resource depletion going on. And we limit pollution. By and large, steel, cement, plastics, and aluminium make up more than 20% of carbon emissions. And we see that all over the world, there is more urban infrastructure being erected because of population growth, because of urbanization. So if we continue to do materials as we've always done, we are toast. The Paris Agreement has no chance, because only the emissions related to infrastructure development and the use of materials will eat up the carbon budget we have. So we have to do it in another way. And I think we are starting to realize how that could be done. And I think three policy issues are very important. One is, it's too cheap to use nature. Tax the use of nature. Because today, the use of virgin materials most often is less expensive than using secondary materials. So what we recycle is not really being well used. Secondly, we need design criteria. And my dream is, in the European Union context, that we would have sort of a formula saying that any product or service put on the European market has to be in the form normally that it can be easily dismantled, and materials and components can be reused and recycled. And the third one is, of course, for the public sector to be a driver in this direction, because the public sector is around 20% of the economy. So if it starts to look for these kind of solutions, it will mean a lot. Finally, the optimal solution is to turn products into services. I don't have to own my mobile phone. I could lease it instead. And I can tell you, if I would lease it, it would be in the interest of the producer to produce something that lasts long, so that they can earn revenue for a long period of time. And at the end of the service, they are also interested in making sure that some of the components and materials that are still of value could be reused. Now, as when they've sold the product, they don't simply care. We have to change that.